and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Over the course of writing many true crime books, it's always fascinated me the unholy alliance that it seems to exist between blood and gold. One of the most common ways that that's expressed is in a ransom note, where someone is missing and it's a situation of money or this person's life. We will return this person if you give money. But in so many ways, our lives are sort of transacted for gold. Whether it is when we work, we sacrifice our lives through labor, through doing work or whatever, and then in exchange for giving up our life force, we get gold, right? We get money. But nowhere is it more explicit than in true crime. When you have a criminal trial, you often see very wealthy, in high-profile cases, you see very wealthy individuals liquidating fantastic amounts of gold in order to defend themselves, in order to prevent themselves from going to jail. It's almost like no amount is too much, and yet you've got to compare that to the crime that they're accused of. No amount of money is too much for them to preserve their own liberty and their own freedom and their own opportunities. But these people have been accused of doing the same to somebody else. And so what has recently come to light, on November the 25th at about 5 p.m., the Denver Post published an article on Christopher Watts agreeing to pay $6 million to the Ruseks in a wrongful death suit. We're going to talk about that in a second. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do. I'm trying to get to 7,000 subscribers before the end of the month. There are 4 days left. Somehow I think that's a bridge too far, but with your help, with your assistance, maybe we can actually get there. 250 subscribers to go. And let's get started. So first of all, the timing of this is quite interesting. It's taken more than a year to reach this point where the civil suit has been settled. It's all been happening very quietly. You don't hear a peep from the Ruseks, you don't hear a peep from the Watts, you don't hear a peep from Chris Watts himself, you don't even hear a peep from the lawyers. So we found out that a judge ordered last week that Watts would need to pay $6 million to Frank and Sandy Rusek, and this sort of concluded the civil case. It's not clear whether Watts sort of provided any opposition to that, whether whether it was a lot like the sentencing hearing where he simply just went along with whatever was going on. It's in a way an absurd amount, because I don't think Watts has $6,000 to his name, let alone $6 million. So whether it was $6 million, $600,000, $60,000 or $6,000, I don't really think it makes much of a difference. I think there is a sense of maybe closure and maybe kind of a sense of satisfaction from the Ruseks that this criminal owes them an amount of money that he can never possibly repay. I think there's some kind of symbolic authenticity in that, but in terms of actually paying money, I mean, the only way Watts could really do that is earning tiny little amounts in prison and then giving it to them, and that's, I don't think that's an incentive he would want to kind of address. I don't think he would want to work hard to pay back a debt like that. Then there is also the house. The house is nowhere near being sold. It's certainly not going to be sold this year. I think the banks are waiting for certain economic tides to turn, and then they might put the house back on the market. In that sense, Watts can contribute a fairly substantial fraction to that $6 million. If the house sells for $400,000 or $500,000, that's still less than 10% of the $6 million. But possibly the reason for this this amount was to make sure that it totally absorbs the full amount of the proceeds from the house. Possibly it was also a big amount because of the appetite to make documentaries. There are constantly documentaries coming out. There've been quite a few, and there's a Lifetime movie coming out in 2 months from now, January 25th, I think, on Lifetime. But I think the appetite to make movies and documentaries and episodes on Watts is going to increase, and then possibly also he may be paid to contribute to that, and that money can then go to the RUSEC. So it may not be entirely pointless. So interestingly, the figure is based on 1 million for each of the deaths. So that's obviously not including Nico, who's not considered by the law as a human being, because of the the fact that he was still in utero and for only 15 weeks. So it is 1 million for Shanann, 1 million for Bella, 1 million for Cece, and then 3 million for emotional pain. And then also what's interesting is it's not as though this amount is just put out there, $6 million, that's it. It's an amount that is going to accumulate at 8% interest. So it's going to be ultimately even more than 6 million. Again, I think that odds of that amount ever being realized is minimal, but it is possible that it may, the amount that Watts ultimately settles may be as high as $1 million ultimately. It may be certainly higher than the value of the house, just in terms of sort of media deals that may be taken on. We've already seen very quickly one book written with Watts's cooperation, and that book has made some money, I think. And then more than likely there will be other books. One can actually imagine Watts wanting to address the constant speculation around it. So you never know, he might actually want to sort of address the narrative that he's put out there, and maybe change that. In this respect, I did reach out to my contact, someone who knows the Watts family, and just asked this person, who ironically enough I've actually blocked on Facebook just because of criticism there, but I did reach out to her just to ask what's his feeling about this book now that it's come out. And despite our disagreement, she did respond, and this is quoting from her response. She said, this is obviously, she's responding to the question that I asked her. So she said, about Chris not being happy with the book, I do think he had it in his head Cadel was going to help him save face, but it didn't work out now, did it? He was holding on to the idea that she was going to make him out to be the choir boy right up until she released his letters, which she never showed his parents, to the Daily Mail. He doesn't currently have the book, but I'm sure he will hear a lot about it. And then another thing mentioned is regarding the mistress. I've read a text message that said that when Sherilyn asked him about the dark things, he didn't know what she was talking about, and Sherilyn had to explain. So anyway, look, that's just hearsay. I don't know whether that text message is true, but what's being suggested here is that the dark things are possibly coming more from Sherilyn's side. I don't know, that's just something that has been mentioned there. But I think for me it's more important to know about the book. I mean, what we know for a fact is that Cadel isn't part of what's his visitors list at this point, and so you've got to ask why. And I do think, I I was under the impression that this book was going to be to help Watts save faces. It was all going to be about how he's found God and all how he's found forgiveness, and that was going to be the center of the story. And I don't really think it was. I think it was a small part of it, but the way I understood it, the book was going to be a very Christian book, and it was all going to be about the journey to God that Chris took, which I thought was going to be very saccharine and very pointless. And as it turned out, that's not what happened. And I do have the impression that Watts was led to believe that was the book that was going to be written as well. That's why I participated. I think it's interesting. I don't know, what was going on at the family level, but it seems a bit strange that, did Watts's folks not see the letters that he wrote to Cadell? And if not, why not? The fact that he doesn't have the book also seems a little bit strange. Why not? Why wouldn't you give the book? So, yeah. But the point is, I don't think Watts, regardless of whether you believe this comment or whether you believe it and disagree with it, I think the obvious thing is I don't think Watts is very happy with the narrative surrounding him, and I think he cares quite a lot about it, and so he may be open to sort of influencing his story going forward. And I think the fact that the current narrative of Watts is all over the place and it's not true, and when I say that, I'm referring to the non-true crime rocket science narrative. I believe True Crime Rocket Science has nailed it. And just in that respect, I just want to clear something up. The first sort of source to ever mention that Bella had suffered her injuries through the thief hatch was True Crime Rocket Science, nobody else. It was mentioned first by True Crime Rocket Science, and it was mentioned, I think, even before the second confession. So it was mentioned really early on, and you can go and check the narratives. You can check where it's mentioned. It's not something that True Crime Rocket Science heard anywhere else. It is original to True Crime Rocket Science. So anyone mentioning that, they are getting it from True Crime Rocket Science. Another thing that I've heard that's a what's the word? I guess a misunderstanding is, it's not the idea that the side of the hatch has got jagged edges or something like that. It's the fact that, in fact, the interior of that hatch, once you go down, is a smooth, cylindrical metal surface. So think of it like almost like the inside of a bottle. I'm just talking about that short little section through the thief hatch, and you can look at a diagram of the interior of the thief hatch to understand it. But the point being, it was the pressure of this surface, the smooth surface of Bella's head against the smooth surface, and then the pressure of her head being pushed downwards. That's what caused the lip to curl up and then the frenulum to tear. So it was literally the lip being pulled vertically upward as the body was being pushed downward. It had nothing to do with it snagging on kind of any kind of. There is no jagged surface. All of the surfaces are smooth. There is the sort of the rim of the thief hatch, but one would imagine if something had happened there would be DNA there or something like that. So I went to some effort to explain why you wouldn't find DNA there, because of the release, because of releasing the valve and all that kind of thing. But the point being, that's original to True Crime Rocket Science. So yeah, I think the narrative of True Crime Rocket Science is the full and final explanation of how the crime actually happened. And then around that, you've got all of this murky stuff where the media are part of it. Even the district attorney are sort of going along with the shadows in the driveway. I think they just want the case shut down. It's sort of, it's got nothing to do with us, hand washing, hand wringing kind of thing. And so who do you turn to for the truth, And so I've been quite disturbed just by, when I occasionally reach out to the media, I think they just associate you with the whole cacophony. And, until one is, until one has distinguished oneself where some kind of credible commentator pats you on the shoulder and says, yeah, that's a fantastic point or whatever, and it catches on, you're going to get the sense of you're just another voice in a sort of a cacophony of voices, and that's unfortunate. That's not unique to true crime rocket science. In many cases, you have the lead detectives, you have the police, all being drowned out by the PR. That is sort of purposefully brought out by often the people, closer and sometimes the people suspected of the crime. You have that in the Ramsey case, you have that in the McCann case, you have that in the Amanda Knox case. So the whole idea then is that you make such a noise that it is difficult to tell what's true and what's not, and it's so easy to just put your foot into the stream somewhere and then just get caught along with it. And what's important is to look from a distance at the people and say, well, what are their agendas? What do they have to gain? What angle are they bringing in? And everyone has some kind of angle, for sure. And you need to look at it from your perspective and say, well, which angle actually makes the most sense? Which person is the most without an agenda, without a horse in the race? And then also, which person's got the most consistent message? Which messages stayed not only rational but also sort of on track? It's sort of just stayed a singular message and it's become more and more reinforced. Because how you differentiate true crime from bogus crime is true crime is going to achieve a laser-like focus, and it's going to get closer and closer and closer to the real thing, and the focus kind of gets narrower and narrower and narrower. You sort of start to exclude conspiracies, you start to exclude potential accessories, you start to exclude the nonsense. That's good true crime. Bad true crime is where it starts to include this one and then that one and then that possibility, then that conspiracy and it just goes on and on and on. And so proper true crime distills, and a good legal criminal case distills from a prosecutor's point of view. A good defense just seeks to sow confusion and reasonable doubt, and everything is doubtful and nothing is based on facts. It's all speculation kind of thing. And everything can be sort of, counted in some kind of way. So it's just important to bear that in mind. There is also an article by a Danish reporter that contacted me. I'm going to deal with that in a video coming up, as well as the Watt sentencing hearing. But just to conclude this episode, going back to the Denver Post, it refers to the Rusick family have not been the same since August 13th. And shame certainly for them. It's a case of both their family torn away from them and them being constantly there. So when somebody dies, it's this horrible situation where no matter what you think or feel or know about what happened to them, there's just this persistent absence that feels inexplicable and feels weird. And you sort of want to pick up the phone and talk to them, but they're not there, and they're never going to be there again. And that's a very horrible situation, and the Rusick family certainly have our compassion in that respect. And then at the same time, you have this horrible counter side to it, which is the ever-presence of these people in the media. They're constantly there, and yet they're not there. And this is part of the whole drama of the Facebook side, is that because Shanann's Facebook profile is still visible, it feels like she's still there. It feels like she's still talking to us. It feels like she's still part of this whole conversation that we're having. When you want to think about what Shanann thought or felt or said or did, or how she appeared, or whatever. There are so many, there are hundreds and hundreds of pictures and videos that are out there. And that's part of the legacy of social media, and it's something maybe families need to think about going forward. Do you want someone's profile to stay public? Do you want that, or do you want to make it private for the family? And the court document goes on to say they've suffered with anger, loneliness, sadness, and depression. For a substantial period of time following the discovery, they were unable to work, leave the house, or even eat. So I think that's where the $3 million comes from. It's basically acknowledging that there was a heck of a lot of pain in the aftermath of this case, more than that would have been usual in another case. And so that's why there are substantial damages. I mean, if you think about it, it's $1 million for each of the victims, and then $3 million, so just as much compensation for the pain. So the deaths are being matched precisely by the amount of pain that the Ruseks say that they've experienced. Just a little further down in the Denver Post is a admission that Watts never fought the civil lawsuit, and on November 5th, so quite a while ago, agreed to the $6 million finding. So it's interesting that the finding has only been released now, on November 26th. It's interesting, this time gap. The Denver Post also refers to a August 1st court filing that refers to Sandy Rusek saying she feels like she dies every day and is always missing and crying for her precious family. And she also adds that it's hard to get out of bed. They cry all the time, every day and every night. It goes on to say Sandy Rusek described the experience of losing her daughter and granddaughters as being adrift in a lifeboat, surrounded by water and without a port in sight. The detailed discovering of how the defendant ended his wife and children's lives was like having the lifeboat removed and sinking into the ocean. 22 years ago, the New York Times did an article on OJ Simpson where he was expected to pay $25 million in a punitive award. And through the course of that time, we know how that has played out with OJ Simpson. We know that he got in trouble with the law at some point, went to jail, but he's now living kind of happily ever after, I think in Las Vegas, and you wouldn't really think that the punitive award is something that's uppermost in his mind all these years later. So in a sense it's a reality, but in another sense it's really just hypothetical. Interestingly, in the OJ Simpson case, he once owned, I think when it was at a maximum, he had sort of $10 million to his name. And I think they estimated his legal fees were close to actually $33.5 million. And at the time, I think he pleaded in court that he was $850,000 in debt. But I guess his brand, in a way, would sort of factor into it, and also his potential to earn a sort of future income. At the time, they also argued that, whatever his debt, he still lived in a mansion, he still had household servants, drove expensive imported cars, was a self-described golf addict, which he still is, and so on. So, that may be another aspect to think about, is certainly if you're out of jail, is how extravagant one is living, and that the media is aware of the stuff. In Chris Watts' case, it's completely different. He's not out of jail. I don't think there are any extravagances. So it's a very different scenario. I'm going to end this particular episode with a quote from Ernest Becker. I'm going to read it to you, and then I will explain it briefly, and then right at the end of the episode I'm going to post a clip from a documentary called Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality, and I'll just leave you with that to ponder. But the whole point in reading this quote is to humanize the Watts case. And what I mean when I say that is we make it something that is personal to the human condition. It's personal to all of us. So in the same way that we can feel compassion for the Ruseks, we could also feel compassion for the Watts family. In the same way that we can feel compassion for the victims, we can also feel compassion for the perpetrator. And I know that turns a lot of people's stomachs. They will say, no, we should be on this person's side or whatever. What I'm saying is this is part of the human condition. All these people are part of the human condition, and so are we. And it's when we acknowledge that's when we come close to starting to fathom kind of what happened here. You'll know what I can see and feel the hysteria building, even having said that. But let me illustrate that through this quote. And what Ernest Becker says is, what does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous if it is not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms. And then this is it. This is the terror, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, and with all of this, yet to die. It seems like a hoax, which is why only one type of cultural man rebels openly against the idea of God. What kind of deity would create such a complex and fancy worm food? End quote. When you take this particular quote from Becker about this terror of the journey of life where you emerge from nothing, you have a name, you develop consciousness, you develop deep inner feelings, and then all of it is lost. We acknowledge the journey of the Watts family. They also emerged from nothing. They built this house, they built this home, they built this family. They built that whole social media fabric. They built a life in Colorado. And with all of that, to die at the end of it. For them to die and for the father to end up in jail, what a waste. What a waste for everybody. What a waste for their extended families on both sides. But what does this tell us about human beings? What does it tell us about life? What does it tell us about us? And it tells us a great deal. It tells us that this is not unique to them. This was a situation that they brought upon themselves. They being certainly Chris Watts and other criminals. But what I'm trying to say is it's a situation that it is where a crime is committed. It's something that you create the disaster for yourself. But in another way, all of us are part of the same thing, which is we will all emerge from nothing. We all came out of the womb. We were given a name. We developed consciousness of self. We developed deep inner feelings. We developed an excruciating inner yearning for life. And no matter whether we live out the course of our lives, whether we manage to get through our lives without committing crimes, we are all going to die. We are all going to lose our lives. We're going to lose our families. Our families are going to lose us. And it just seems kind of inexplicable. And so one's got to ask, what does one do with this? What does one do with this um, this strange, inexplicable situation that doesn't seem to make any sense. And it's through Chris Watts that we can start to sort of fathom that. We look at him in jail, he's responsible for what he did. How does he deal with it? And we see the answer is that he sort of can't. He doesn't. He lies about it. He makes up a scapegoat in some kind of dark matter, some kind of dark phantasm apparently. Um, he forgives himself using some kind of other power. Is there a lesson in that for ourselves? And I think there's a lot of there's a big clue to the reason why this crime happened in this, and it's something I've mentioned in a episode about evil, which is evil isn't about selfishness. It's about trying to achieve a heroic self-image. It's trying to beat away the attrition and the atrophy of death. And when you say death, it's all those things that diminish us. It's all those things that deprive us of being alive, right? And for some people, that can be another person. For some people, that can be what someone says about us. For some people, that can be a social death. A social death can be just as real as a real death. And there's another really important sense in how we can feel death, and that is with money. If we feel that someone has taken our money, taken what is ours, it can feel like death. It can feel like everything we've worked for our whole lives is going to be taken away. And if you're another person, taking that away may not feel like much. If you're another person destroying another person, it may not seem like much destroying another person. But if you're the person being destroyed, it does feel like a lot. It feels like a lot is happening. And so certainly in the financial sense, if we talk about the 6 million that the Ruseks want to receive in compensation, one can almost put a mirror to that and say, look at this person who came from nowhere in Spring Lake, grew up poor, and then ended up with so much in Colorado. Even though they were living beyond their means, he'd come a long way from Spring Lake. He was living in this big house. He was sort of living quite a privileged life, going on trips and so on. Whether or not he was totally signed up to it, and whether or not they could afford it, that was the life that he was living, and he didn't want to give it up. And so even though he wanted to no longer be married to his wife, and he didn't want the family he wanted, he didn't want to lose everything. And that is part of that journey of having emerged from nothing and having an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And like it or not, and believe it or not, Watts had those feelings as well. And to the extent that we as outsiders look at him and say he's a monster, and certainly what he did was monstrous, but to the extent that we look at him and say he's an empty vessel, he's a nobody and a nothing with nothing inside of him, no feelings, we dissociate ourselves from the human condition ourselves. We dissociate ourselves from knowing ourselves and also knowing others. And when we give him labels and we give these people in these crimes disorders, we dissociate ourselves from this human journey that we all are on, that we have all emerged from nothing. We've all come to have a name. We've all come to have consciousness of self. We all have deep inner feelings. We all have an excruciating inner yearning. Some of us have it in a different way. Some of us have it more than others. Some of us have these feelings in less emotional ways and more emotional ways. But we all have deep inner feelings. We all have desires. We all have things that call to us and that we respond to. And yet, all of us, in all our differences, share common fate. We're all going to die. And I think in this terrible quandary that we find ourselves in. The difference with criminals is that they feel this fatedness, this fraught situation much more keener than we do, and they sort of feel justified that they need to kill someone else in order to gain life, or to preserve the life that they have, or to keep the life that they have going. And this is the reason why a lot of us don't understand true crime or the motives. Is there are rational motives that are anchored to real things, like people literally killing for money, or people literally killing in self-defense, or whatever it is. But then there are also symbolic crimes where you are killing to protect your reputation. You're killing to protect your accumulated wealth, right? And even in that, where you are killing for money, you are killing for something that's really a symbol. I mean, what is money? Money is a symbol of something. It's almost an accumulation of stored life. But in the same way, it's a symbol of death. I mean, if all your work is stored up money, then all of that money is the symbol of your death, and that death can buy you new life. But it's still. Do you see that sort of conundrum, that death and life are intermingled? And this is why I say you have this strange, unholy alliance in true crime between blood and gold. And I think that says a lot about the human condition and our attitudes to life and our attitudes to death. And so I think this $6 million settlement, I think, kind of addresses it. It says, there's a lot of money at stake here. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of life was at stake. A lot of life was lost, and a lot of pain associated with that loss. And it's important to acknowledge it. It's important to acknowledge both sides, the blood and the gold.
To have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And with all this, yet to die.